Hello everyone, it's Dr. Poros. For this video, I've walked to my local cemetery, which is probably a bit of a strange location to talk about animal welfare. But this cemetery is on the route of my dog walk, and I often pass by these two castor oil plants that you can see, one right behind me and one just over the path. And they get me thinking about individual differences and individual responses to the environment. Why is one of these castor oil plants really big, really vibrant and clearly thriving, whereas the other one is much smaller, it's not doing as well, and it doesn't look as great? They're both in the same soil, they're both in the same location, they both get the same access to light and resources. So why are there individual differences in how individuals cope with their environment and how they grow and thrive in what looks like to be similar conditions? What is it about the specifics of the individual that means some do well and some find life more of a challenge? So these two castor oil bushes are really nice examples of how the individual itself should always be considered when we look at animal welfare and we look at these responses to the environment that we might be providing.
Obviously, I'm not expecting plants to be as complicated as animals when it comes to welfare state. But what I'm trying to identify here are individual differences that exist in a seemingly similar environment. The large bush on the left and the smaller bush on the right. From a visual perspective, one might be seeming to do much better in these conditions than the other. But we need to look more closely at the individuals. What is it about this one, its background, experiences, or patch of soil that it's growing in, make it look much healthier? And why is this shrub, which might have been planted at a similar time, looking so much weaker? Is there difference to the soil composition? Are there differences to the light intensity or water that it gets from surrounding plants? When it was a cultivar, or the seeds that were grown to produce it, perhaps the experiences of the parent plants, drought or nutritional deficiency, affected their abilities to grow and thrive, and therefore the quality of the seeds that were produced. Either way, it's really important that regardless of how we're tending to living things in our care, we consider the individual and the individual's needs. Some different specimens might be more sensitive to environmental changes. They might come from a lineage that can't deal with future challenges as well, and that needs to be built into the care that is provided. So yes, these are plants, and yes, their welfare, as it were, is not going to be affected by the environment to the same degree as an animal's welfare would be, but they're still a really nice example of individual differences. We can look at what the individual tells us, and therefore we can use that as evidence to dig deeper into why we might see some individuals doing well and others finding life more of a challenge. And then we can consider the variation in the population alongside of the individual differences that we see, what the individual is telling us, and we can make changes. We can adapt or alter practice so that all individuals, regardless of their coping strategy, get the ability to do well under those current conditions. Individual variation is clear to see in a range of populations. Fallow deer, for example, occur in naturally different occurring colour morphs: dark, melanistic, pale, spotted. And these different phenotypes might exist within the population for particular reasons. Or there might be no behavioural differences and coping strategies between the phenotypes. But it's worthwhile looking more closely at the interactions between the things that we can see that animals possess, how they deal with environmental changes, and how that might impact on the welfare that they may experience under certain conditions. And this is particularly important when we manage populations. Perhaps there are selective elements that make one phenotype have adaptive benefits compared to others, and have we considered the effects of that in the managed environment that we provide? Let's look at this from a theoretical perspective. Here we've got a normally distributed trait, and the mean of that particular trait is something to do with how the individual or the species copes within the environment. Let's imagine that the mean is the coping strategy under stable environmental conditions. Little variation, the species or population has evolved for a particular set of conditions, and it is adapted to be able to gather resources, to breed successfully, and to cope with the challenges of living under relatively stable conditions. There's always going to be variation within a population. There may be genetic components of some individuals that allow them to cope better if conditions vary. And there will be the genetic components of some individuals in the population that mean they don't cope well under variable conditions. So let's imagine that our green animals are those that do well. They might be behaviourally plastic or flexible. And our yellow animals do less well when conditions change. We know in wild, free-living populations, differences in behavioural phenotype and genotype exist. Balancing selection can keep the different forms of an individual within a population existing because there are advantages to each different form. The red-headed version of the Gordian finch is more dominant, it's more aggressive, and it's more likely to be in charge over resources. However, the red-headed Gordian finch is more susceptible to social stresses. The black-headed Gordian finch is less easily stressed. It's not as aggressive, and it won't dominate over resources to the same degree. Female Gordian finch, they prefer to mate with the red-headed males. But the advantages of being black-headed, i.e. coping better with environmental changes, keeps both phenotypes within the population. Of course, this doesn't work with every population, and sometimes environmental conditions change so that the individuals that are better at coping with variation are the ones that ultimately succeed. Let's imagine that the environment does change and the distribution of these traits within the population shifts. What we end up with is a new mean that would be based around some component of those green individuals, the ones that do well in variable conditions. The old distribution and the old mean of the population die out. Consequently, this might form a new species or subspecies. It might lead to a speciation event in that population. It might lose genetic information from the population and go through a bottleneck. Or this could also be a domestication event. This is why it's so important to consider how individuals cope and respond to the captive environment. When we're keeping individuals in the zoo, when we're doing managed ex situ breeding programs, we want to make sure that we are conserving the genotype of all individuals within the population. There might be really important wild type traits that are held in those yellow individuals, but if they don't cope and they don't breed and their reproductive success is poorer, those genes for being better in the wild might be lost. The green individuals that are more behaviourally flexible might cope better in the captive environment because there's some trait that they possess that allows them to interact with humans in a more positive manner. This might make them less suitable for reintroduction, less suitable for conservation work. So it's important that we always consider how we manage populations and how we manage individuals to ensure that we're conserving the full genotype of the animal and all that future adaptive potential. And here is a potential example of a species that wasn't behaviourally flexible, that couldn't cope with environmental change, and is now sadly extinct. This is the Labrador duck, and these are stuffed specimens at the American Museum of Natural History, a male with his black and white plumage and a female in her brown plumage. And the Labrador duck population declined between 1850 and 1870, and the extinction event is thought to have occurred somewhere around 1878. From early records, Labrador ducks have always been rare, but their extinction is still poorly understood by science and hasn't been fully explained. Labrador ducks were hunted, but their flesh tasted poor and rotted quickly, and it fetched a low price at market, so other birds were hunted more favourably. Environmental change is likely to have been the cause of the extinction of the Labrador duck. It was particularly dependent on mussels and other shellfish that occurred along the eastern seaboard, and changes to this environment, potentially caused by industrialisation and the growth in pollutant effluents, altered the population of mussels and other shellfish that the duck depended upon. No other species of wildfowl was or is as dependent upon shallow water mollusks as the Labrador duck. Its restrictive range and the specific type of food that it fed on meant it found it difficult to cope with the challenges of a changed environment. There were no new ecosystems that it was able to exist within, and consequently, if the environment changed, sadly, the bird went extinct. But this is not the case for all species. Some species do really well in new environments. These are mandarin ducks. They are living in Richmond Park in southwest London, but they're not native to Richmond Park. The mandarin duck comes from China. They've been doing successfully in the United Kingdom for a number of years. The beautiful colour patterns of the male mandarin allow him to attract a female. They gather together and display to each other and then choose their partners. This choice of partner is dependent on the quality of the plumage, the intensity of the courtship display, and therefore the show of strength and fitness that the male mandarin can display to the female. Individual differences in quality are going to be affected by the environment, the food that he can access, the best perching and roosting areas that he can sit on to preen his beautiful feathers and keep them clean and tidy. Competition with other animals. You can see there is also a male mallard in this photograph as well. The mandarin, as the introduced or non-native species, has to cope with the native wildlife and fit in alongside of it. But for those individuals that do cope, and for those individuals that are successful, if there is an empty niche that they can fill, the population can be successful. So unlike the Labrador duck, the mandarin, with its versatility, ability to adapt to a new habitat, and its strategy of breeding in trees, which is something that not many other ducks in the United Kingdom do, has allowed it to fit into a new environment, to cope with the potential changes and challenges imposed on it by the native species that already exist there, and with a breeding strategy that means it is able to deal with that competition successfully. It finds coping with challenges much easier. These generalist species are therefore the ones that are likely to do much better in a human-created environment. Individual differences are really important to social behaviour and social bonds. How you assort and interact with other members of your group is going to be very much dependent on personality, or behavioural syndrome, as we call it in animal behaviour circles, and the consistency of your behavioural syndrome. Do individuals group by personality? And are those personality characteristics more likely to allow that individual behavioural flexibility that allows it to cope with changing environments? And we know that different mixes of personalities within social groups can really help individuals meet the needs of finding new resources. For example, bold individuals might be able to access new resources because they're less neophobic, but shy individuals that hold back are going to be the early warning to predators. And these mix of personalities and this mix of social types are really important to species that have very complex aggregations. This murmuration of starlings, for example, might be a really nice example of selfish herding, a social behaviour where everybody is doing the same thing to reduce predation. But the personality of the birds within the flock and the collective behaviour that they display might be really important to the survival of all individuals. Perhaps it's important for social behaviour to be performed by everybody in exactly the same way in that situation. But once the individuals are out of that social environment, individual personality might also be important. And these individual personalities and how individuals can use that personality to cope with environmental change are really important for territorial species. Here we've got an adult male mute swan in the top of the photograph driving away 3 juveniles from his territory. You can see the difference in bill colour compared to the mature adults with a very dark orange bill and the 3 juveniles with much paler bills. The only reason that male mute swan is able to hold on to this really important, really attractive patch of wetland habitat is because of his aggressive personality. He's driving away other individuals because he wants to keep all of the resources within that territory for himself and his mate so they can successfully breed. Swans that are unsuccessful at finding a mate will not hold a territory. And those species, like we've mentioned with the mandarin duck, that are able to find a niche within an ecosystem can spread successfully through it. Here is an example of great white egrets on the Somerset levels. The great white egret is a relatively new species that has sped naturally to the United Kingdom. Unlike the mandarin duck, it hasn't been brought here by humans, but it is gradually spreading around the country. And in this photograph, you can also see 2 other species of heron that are native to the UK. The grey heron, which has been the resident bird for many, many years, and the little egret, the small white bird, which is also a relative newcomer. How these individual species cope and the resources that they need and their behavioural flexibility has meant that these 3 species of heron can coexist. And coexisting alongside of humans is something that some species do really, really well. Let's go back to the mute swan. These are mute swans that are existing on the River Thames, and they're actually grazing on the algae that's growing on the sides of HMS Belfast, an old battleship that is moored in the Thames as a visitor attraction. This is a really nice example of the flexibility of these birds to be able to find food in a human-created environment. And that's the reason why the mute swan has been so successful. And in some parts of the world, like the mandarin, has been introduced and is now a feral species. But now let's look at a different species of swan. This is the hooper swan, a migratory bird that comes to the United Kingdom in the wintertime. It travels from its breeding grounds in Iceland to various areas of northern Britain. The hooper swan wouldn't be seen dead in the centre of London, thank you very much. That's a habitat that's not suitable for it. Its territorial behaviour, its requirements for its breeding and nesting grounds are much more specific. So this animal is less likely to deal with future challenges well. And let's bring that full circle to the captive environment. We know the personality differences, and we know the evolutionary history of a species plays a role in coping in the managed environment. This giraffe is performing an oral stereotypic behaviour, and that might be down to its background, its early life experiences, as well as its needs to forage. And giraffes forage in a very particular manner. If we don't provide that ability of foraging in captivity, we can see frustration behaviours. as was demonstrated by the foot stamping in that individual. I hope this presentation, that's gone all the way from castor oil plants to giraffes via a few swans and ducks, has shown you the importance of the consideration of the individual when we look at coping. Remember Donald Broom's original definition of animal welfare, the state of the individual as it attempts to cope with its environment. Individuals differ in how they meet the demands of living in a dynamic environment. When we provide that dynamic environment in captivity, we must enable their coping mechanisms to not interfere with their welfare state. We shouldn't find stereotypic behaviour as an acceptable way of coping. We must provide all of the naturalistic facets of the environment that the individual should engage with, so its natural behaviour patterns allow it to cope, allow it to behave normally, and therefore conserve its future adaptive potential. So if it is used for conservation work, all of those wild type behaviours and adaptive traits haven't been diluted, and we haven't seen any form of domestication to the human created world. Thank you very much.